Music theory with OneNote, using the scale formula to create not only the major scale in the key of C, not only the major scale off of all other 12 notes in the musical alphabet, but also all 7 modes off of all 12 notes within the musical alphabet. It's actually not that complicated. We'll show you how it works. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're playing with just one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of the modal node system, MNS presentation 1135 Excel modes formula. One of only 4 presentations we have thus far, but we plan on adding plenty more shortly. Also note that while in OneNote, we can spend all of our time analyzing the table, working on theory, but we also have another presentation by this number and name where we actually build these tables within Excel, practicing our visualization of tables as well as our Excel tools, which I highly recommend doing. Now, in a prior presentation, we went through the first part of this, which is to use the formula for the major scale. We often call it the major scale formula, to then create the major scale in the key of C as well as all other of the 12 notes. I'm going to give a quick recap of that and then move on to the new thing, which is then to look at the modes. And the modes is where things get a little bit wonky with the numbering system, which leads to like the way we think about intervals. So we want to touch in on that. But just remember that as we do this, we're going to end up with how many scales. If you're trying to intimidate someone, then what would you say as a music master? If you're a music master, what do you have to memorize? You've got to memorize 12 different sets or scales. You can say major scales. And then you also have to memorize 7 modes, so it'd be 12 times 7. But in reality, as we can see here from a shape perspective, which is what we're basically putting most of our time in on, as we can see here, it's more like we have one master shape that could then be copied and pasted, shifted up or back into the 12 notes, the 12 different positions, and then within that shape, you can use any of the points as the nodal center point, building, in essence, a new scale, leading us to some terminology that's a little bit more specific, often not what I see actually being used. That being, when we talk about a scale, usually that means that we're talking about something that's in ascending order, or most technically, that's how you would say it, right? It's something in ascending order, and you're starting on a particular note. So we're starting on the C, and then we're going to be counting upwards stepwise. Or in practice, I think most people mean it as, this is going to be my tonic, my center point, the place I'm going back to all the time. Whereas if I look at all of these notes that are just the 7 notes, I can think of them more broadly as a collection of notes. So if you call them a collection of notes and not a scale, what you've done is listed all of the notes that then could have 7 center points, right? So you have the 7 notes, and then we could pick a center point, and whatever that center point is, we call that like the tonic. You can build a scale from that point. So if I had ascending order from any note within it, then we're going to say that that's going to be another mode. So that's where the modes come from. So notice they're all related, they're all tied together. So it's not really the idea that you have to have 12 times 7 shapes, but when we write them out in scales, that's what it ends up looking like. So let's map it out and try not to get overwhelmed by that, because it's really not that complicated. So then I'm going to say the notes, we numbered the notes, and then we also gave a letter for the notes. So I would highly recommend that we have a numbering system for the notes so that you can use some simple math. And remember, I'm also going to use an abbreviation of AB for A sharp or B flat, so that it's the simplest thing for coding purposes that we can kind of look at. The formula, we talked about how to derive it. We're now just going to think of it as a priori formula. For the major scale formula is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Now here's the other thing that really kind of bothers me about when people present this stuff, because they often say that we have all these modes and all the modes are different when actually there's the same set of notes. And sometimes I feel like that's not made clear. Similarly with the formula, we could say that there's a different formula for each mode. But really, it's the same formula. It's just that you're starting at a different point. I think that intuitively is a lot easier to visualize. So in other words, if I take what we looked at last time, we made this formula to create the major scale. Whole steps represent that we're going to take two steps, and a half step represents our baseline unit of distance, which is a 1 step. Our formula would make sense intuitively that we take 2 steps, 2 steps, 1 step, 2 steps, 2 steps, 2 steps. Why? Because normally we take 2 steps because it's too close together if we don't take 2 steps, right? So that's good. The formula will look like this: 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, and then 1 brings us back home. If we apply that formula out to our key of C, which I'm going to say is number 4, using a number system, 4 plus this 2 gets us to 6, 6 plus this 2 gets us to 8, 8 plus this 1 gets us to 9, 9 plus this 2 gets us to 11, 11 plus this 2 gives us to 11, 12, 13. But remember, there's a circular form, so we don't go above 12. So if I'm 13 minus 12 gets us to 1, and then 1 plus this 2 gets us to 3, and then 3 plus this 1 gets me back to the 4 as we go around in the circle. Now you can imagine then, well, what if I make this the tonic? What if I make the D the tonic? Well, then you're going to have the same collection of notes if I make the D the tonic, but you can also imagine that I build the formula off of the D note. What if I build the formula off of the D note? Well, all I would do is start the formula from the second bit because I'm starting on the second node. See how it's not really a different formula because it's just going to say, okay, I'm going to start from here then. So if I go down here and check that out, if I make the D the starting point, so now I just pulled this D and made it the starting point, then I would apply the formula out starting here at this 2. So right, so then you'd have a whole, half, whole, half, and then whole, which would be 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, 2. So that means if I'm on the 6, which is a D, then I'm going to say apply the formula from that second point, and I get the same collection of notes. These are called relative scales. So we'd say this is 2, 6 plus 2 gets me to 8, 8 plus 1 gets me to 9, 9 plus 2 gets me to 11, 11 plus 2 gets me 12, 13. There's only 12 notes in the musical alphabet. 13 minus 12 is 1. 1 plus 2 gets me to 3. 3 plus 1 gives me to 4. And 4 plus 2 gets me back to the 6. So that's what we want. So from a practical standpoint, the general idea when you're playing is usually going to be, hey, look, I've got the same collection of notes here, and I'm going to make a different note, basically the tonic. And if I do that, I'm in essence playing in a different mode is the general idea. Now, there is utility to thinking of your collection of notes as being spaced out by the formula. So there's 3 ways we can imagine, let's say, the scale degree. There's 3 ways that we can kind of think about it on, say, a fretboard or whatever your instrument is. One is that I can remember just like the shape, which I might do on the guitar in particular. So on the guitar, I might say, hey, look, how do I know which notes are in what I'm playing? I'm just going to remember the caged system, or I'm going to remember the pentatonic shapes or the 3-note per string shapes. Now, as you do that, a lot of people don't take it the next step and memorize all of the positions. They might memorize the notes, which is good. You can do that, but it's not the most effective thing. What's the most effective thing? To memorize the names of the modes, the positions, which you could give an absolute numbering system, which I would based on the relative positions of the major scale. But that's one way we can memorize. I've memorized all of these points on a shape perspective. That's one way that you can do it. Another way that you can do it is you can say that I'm going to derive this from the formula. So I'm going to derive it from the formula. If it was a major scale, whole, half, whole, half. So I could derive that on my fretboard, for example. If I'm down here, I could say, okay, if I'm on this C, it would be whole, half, whole, and there'd be a half up here. But that's on one string. which isn't optimal for a guitar typically. In a guitar, I want to be within a 4-finger position. That's how it's designed. So you can see it this way. You've got a whole step, and then there's 5 notes between the 2 strings. So it's going to be 5, and then if I go backwards, 4, 3, 2. So there's going to be a whole step, right? And then a half step, and then a whole step, and then there's a distance of 5, 4, 3, 2, whole step, half step. So that's how you can see it on the guitar using that same whole and half step, which is possibly something that much more utilized on a piano, the piano being laid out on just kind of like one string. What's the third way that you can think about it? We could think about it by interval distances. I could think about my C here and say, let me measure each position around it in relation to the C. Let's take like this C, right? So this one's a 2-note away. I have a distance from the C in the major scale of a 2-note away major second. This one is a 4-note away major third. How do I know that? Because there's 5 notes here. Back one is 4, and then right a 5-note away, which is a perfect fourth. So we'll talk about that later. But those are the 3 ways that we can kind of map things out. They all have their pros and cons on the fretboard, but I would argue the best thing to learn for all of them is typically going to be the relative position, the modes, the nodes that you're on. All right, so if I go back on up, so that's going to be the idea. So now this one we mapped out in the key of C, and we also gave it the Roman numerals. We said that the Roman numerals can allow us and help us to build or see whether we build a major chord on it or a minor chord. Notice how useful that is, because now I can see that the 1, 4, 5, I build a major triad, which we'll talk about later, and the 2, 3, 6, I build a minor triad, and then this one is the diminished. That's why it has a little bit of a dot. Okay, so then if I was to copy this across, remember I can copy and paste this, and I can do this for all of the 12 notes in the musical alphabet. So that would be just like copying and pasting on the fretboard. So now I have this collection of notes. If I do it in ascending order, then that would be the key of C, major. And then I have this collection of notes. If I do it in ascending order, that would be an A. And then I went to the 2, and so we went to the second note, which once again, if it was in an ascending order, it would be an A sharp major, and so on and so forth, and we can go all the way across. Now all this is doing from a guitar standpoint is just like what it's doing with this worksheet. How did I build this worksheet? I copied this, pasted it over here, all of the relative cells copied over. That's exactly what you do on a fretboard, right? It's the exact same thing. So that's what's going to give us all the 12 different collections of notes. Now, when we do that, we say it's in the key of C. Now, what if I have the same collection of notes, but like I say, I make the D the tonic? Well, then there's nothing different on this from a shape perspective. It's the same shape. It's now just that I made the D the tonic of the shape. But if I was to build the formula from this position, you could rename the formula as 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, but really, it's the same 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, or whole, half, whole, half. It's just that you're starting on the second one. See, that's how you want to visualize it. You want to visualize it. Look, I'm on Dorian, therefore I'm starting on the second position. So that means going from this second position, I'm starting on the whole step from there, rather than saying I'm on the Dorian. It's a totally new thing, and therefore I have to imagine a formula that's completely different and independent from the major scale formula. No, it's all the same thing. It's all connected, right? You want to visualize, you want to think in your brain that I don't want to build new things in my brain that are completely isolated if I don't have to. What do I want to do? I want to build on a foundation. The foundation I've known, I've memorized this formula. I already have it. So I don't want to memorize a whole new formula per se. I want to say I can build on this and say, look, I'm just starting from the second position. So that means I'm starting on the whole, half, whole, half, whole, because I'm just starting on the second position. So that's going to be the general idea, but you can see how they think about it then when we write it as though it's a new formula, because now I have here it's a 6 plus this 2 is an 8, plus this 1, and so on. And we get the same collection of notes. Now, you could say, what if I made this a D? Couldn't I make it a C? If I made it a C, what would happen? Well, then you apply the same formula, but it wouldn't be the related notes. We call those parallel notes. Parallel notes. And the reason they're parallel is because you could play something like a chord that's in the key of C and then use the parallel construction to make a Dorian kind of chord, which we'll talk about later. It wouldn't be in the same key diatonically, but it would all be relative position would be the same. Let me show you what I mean on the fretboard, just so you can see it. And this is often the choice that we have. If I'm building a chord off of this C, then let's say it was a C major triad, I would build a chord off of that. If I move up to the D and I build a chord, we'll talk about this later, but you'd end up with a minor chord, right? You'd end up with a minor chord if you're in the same diatonic scale. But you could say, maybe I don't want to be in the same diatonic scale. Maybe I'm going to say I'm going to play a chord in the key of C and then shift this up and play as though I'm in the D Ionian, meaning a major chord here. That would probably still sound okay, not because it's in the same diatonic key possibly, but because the shape is completely parallel. And you can see that on the fretboard because you're going to use the same like bar chord. If you use the same bar chord over here, it might still sound good even if it's not diatonically consistent, not the same collection of 7 notes, because all of the relative positions, all of the relative ratios are exactly the same. That's kind of what happens in the blues when you play the 7 to the 7 to the 7. So you're playing things that are technically not in the same diatonic key, but they're all completely parallel. So those are usually your two choices, right? Do I want to play something that's all in the same key, or do I want to play something that's all completely parallel? They both have their own kind of feel to them, right? So you can test those two concepts out. But oftentimes people get confused between the two, and that's what we're trying to limit here, right? So if you're staying in the same key, same collection of notes, we would just build off of the second one here, right? So we're building off of the 6, and then we apply the formula from that point outwards. What if I build off of the next one? So now I'm going to start from the third one. So I'm going to say the third one down is the E. So I'm going to pull that 8. That's going to be my starting point, and we would call this the Phrygian, which I would call absolute mode number 3. Absolute mode number 3, the Phrygian mode. And so now we start on the 8, and what's going to be our formula? Well, it's just going to be as though we started on the third one down. So we're going to start here and then just apply the same formula. So I'm on the third note as compared to the major scale. Notice what we're doing here. We're focusing on the major scale as though it's our key, our reference key, which is typical to do in Western music, but you don't have to do it that way. We could have derived this formula just from the formula standpoint with any other formula. I could have used Dorian as my key and look at all of the other modes in relation to the Dorian. That's just not, so the mode, there's nothing special from just like a modal standpoint in terms of them all being connected and possible to be derived from each other. So, but the major scale was historically what we came up with first, and you can argue, why scientifically it might be more useful or in some contexts or whatnot, which we might talk about later. But there's nothing special from the fact that you could derive each from each other. They're all connected. So, but it's practical then to say I'm going to assign a numbering system based on the major scale, which I would call the absolute modes. So in other words, I'm going to name these notes, all of these notes, I'm going to name them with a numbering system like the Nashville music system does on these notes. But instead of saying I'm just going to write all the songs as though they're in C major, even though the tonic is the D, I would rather recognize, as some jazz guys are doing, I believe, right, that D is the tonic and I'm playing in D Dorian, but I don't want to renumber the system to make this D the 1. You see, that's the problem. If I call it a scale, I have to make this D the 1. That means I have to renumber the same set of notes. That means when I'm looking at the fretboard, looking at the relative relationships, I have to renumber in my mind the set of notes. I don't want to do that. I want to see this as a node. A point doesn't change. It's mode number 2. Absolute node number 2 doesn't change. And if I do that, then it's like, well, then I just build my chords off of that node. And I know that that node is Roman numeral number 2. Therefore, it's a minor mode. Therefore, it's a minor chord that I'm going to construct. What's going to be the next one down? It's going to be an absolute mode number 3, right? So that, and I also can memorize the formula more easily because I know that if whatever I'm building off of absolute mode number 2 is going to have a half step. There's always a half step between absolute mode number 2 and absolute mode number 3. You see, if I say this is now the 1, then I have to renumber where the whole steps and half steps lie. But if I keep that as mode number 2, then I can say, well, there's always when you go from mode number 2, the Dorian, to mode number 3, the Phrygian, then I'm sorry, that's always going to be a whole step, right? And then from 3 to 4, there's going to be a half step. So I could start to memorize the positions a lot more easily if I don't renumber the system. Now, so I want to keep that in mind. That's the big thing that I'm kind of advocating for, which is similar to the Nashville numbering system. That'll make it a lot easier for you to memorize the fretboard. It'll make it a lot easier to memorize the formula, and it'll be a lot easier to build chords off of. What's going to be the problem with that? It's going to be a problem because when people say they're in the key of D, they're going to renumber the system 1 through 7, and you're going to have to be able to code switch back and forth between, oh, I see what they're saying. They're saying it's in Dorian. I'm going to say that's absolute mode number 2. They're going to call that the 1. So we'll talk more about how to do that, but that's going to be the one issue, and then the chords will be named that way. So that's what we'll talk about later. Okay, so then obviously you could, now that we've done this, you can take the Dorian off of any of the 12 notes. So now I could say, well, what about this collection of notes in the key of C starting on the A? Well, I could do the same thing and take the second note of those collection of notes and make it the first note, and then we would be playing in this. Now, I didn't do it exactly that way. I said, this is A, this is 1. So now I'm going to say that this is A Dorian versus A mix or Ionian or major. So this would be A major. These are not the same notes because this would be A Dorian. So this would be the parallel construction. But you can see, of course, once I do this, I can start with any note here of our 12 notes, use the formula, and now we can build, using the formula, all 12 of the Dorian scales, if we want to see it that way. So that's going to be that. And then, of course, on the Phrygian, we're going to call that absolute. I'm going to call it absolute mode number 3. So we could take the relative absolute mode number. We apply the formula from that starting point. So we get an 8 plus a 1 is a 9, plus a 2 is an 11, plus a 2 is 12, 13. 13 minus 12 is 1, plus 2 is 3, plus 1 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 2 gets us back to 8. And then, of course, we can do that same formula off of every of the 12 notes within the musical alphabet. And then we could do the same thing for the next one. What do we call the next one? We call it Lydian. So I want to keep the name. I would still call it absolute mode number 4. It's got an uppercase if you say it's a Roman numeral, because it's going to be what we could call a major mode. And so then we would just start the formula from that point. So now we're looking at the Lydian, which is going to be the F. And so we would start the formula from that too, right? So here, and we would just count that down. So I'm going to go, okay, so here's the Lydian in F, which is a 9, plus 2 is 11, plus 2 is 13, minus 12 is 1, plus 2 is 3, plus 1 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 1 is 8. I'm sorry, plus 2 is 8, plus 1 gets us back to 9. So that's going to be that. Now, again, I would want to keep this one as the Lydian absolute mode number 5. I want to keep that node name the same, but they're going to want to try to rename it to the 1. And this is one reason that this happens is when we start to get to the intervals, which is distance. They're going to use the scale degree to label the interval. And that's another thing that's going to kind of cause us problems. There's a way to deal with that. I'll show you how we deal with that when we get to intervals. I just want to give you kind of a precursor of that. Also remember, as we do these scales, you might get confused by thinking that the mode, I'm talking about the mode two different ways here. One is by point. I'm saying this is that point that we're starting on, the node within the system, the mode within the system, and by scale, meaning that's the starting point, and if we count up from that point or make that the tonic, that's the starting point. So from a fretboard standpoint, if I'm looking at the Lydian mode, then we're going to say it's going to be here with the Y stands for the Lydian. So I could think of it as the fretboard as this note, that node, that point within the system is always going to be Lydian or absolute mode number 4. And then you can also think of it from a scale. If I build the scale from there, I can build my formula from that point and continue on with my formula and build out the formula. And I can also build then my intervals from there. The intervals are going to be a problem though, because I want to keep it as absolute mode number 4. And the interval is going to say something like if I say this point over here, how far away is that? 5, 4. The interval is going to want to say that's a 4 note away. I say 4 note away. Most people don't. It's 4 note away. It's going to be a major third. So it's a major third distance. That 3 doesn't stand for the distance. It stands for the relative scale degree, which means I have to make that the 1 if I'm thinking that way and say that this is the third of the set of notes. What would I rather do, precursor, when we get to there? I'd rather say, hey, look, let's not make this head the head of a kid. If you got the 10-foot basketball hoop, 3-foot kid, let's not measure counting the kid's head to the top of the hoop, his head being foot 1, 8 feet away. No, from the top of the head. I don't need to renumber this to measure, in other words. How far should it be? It should be 2 modal half steps, right? Which 2 modal half steps is what I'm going to call it. Which if you made that the 1 is always going to be 1 number off from a coding standpoint, off by 1, plus 1 would give you the third from a scale degree distance. So again, I'll talk about that more later. You can follow the logic on that if you want. You don't have to use that terminology, but it might help you to just be aware of it once we get to scale degrees. All right, so then we can do this all the way across. And so we can have the Phrygian applying that formula to every 12 notes in the musical alphabet. What's the next one? We've got Mixolydian, kind of like the bluesy one here. We'll talk about why later. But all we're going to do is if I want to make the related one, I'm going to say, where was it? This is going to be the 5. So if I take this number and system, same collection of notes, and I take the 5, I'm going to say that this is the 5 mode, which is, I would call the Mixolydian mode. So we're going to go down and say, okay, now we're going to make that. I'll put that first. I don't want to rename it, but from a scale degree position, they would rename it. I want to still call it mode number 5 and keep that constant. And then we're going to say that's going to be an 11. And then we start the formula from that point down. So it's whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And we're going to start from this whole, right? 11 plus 2 is 13 minus 12 is 1. 1 plus 2 is 3. 3 plus 1 is 4. 4 plus 2 is 6. 6 plus 2 is 8. 8 plus 1 is 9. 9 plus 2 is 11. And then we can apply that formula all the way across. And what's the next one? The next one is Aeolian. This is the big one because this is the minor key. So in Western music, they kind of came to the idea that they just like major and minor for a certain time frame, and they kind of threw all the other modes under the bus. Right? So we have all of our naming convention is based off major and minor. Again, I'm going to suggest that that's not what we would like to do optimally at this time, because I would like to name my chords based on the modes, because that gives me a position on the fretboard. So the minor key, what am I going to do? It's the Aeolian mode. So what are we going to do? We're going to take the 6. So if I take the 6th of here, from the major to make the relative, the 6 was an A. If I start from the A and apply the formula from that point, from after the 6, then we would get the same collection of notes that we had with the major key. So we start with an A, which is a 1, plus 2 is 3, plus 1 is 4, plus 2 is 6, 6 plus 2 is 8, 8 plus 1 is 9, 9 plus 2 is 11, and 11 plus 2 minus 12 gets us back to the 1, right? So that's going to be the minor key. And remember that the minor key is still just another mode. Major and minor, they're trying to hide it, I guess. They don't like the modes, the Greek names, Ionian and Aeolian, but they are just two of the modes, and they're related, which is important to know because that'll help out to go back and forth between them. So then we have all of the other minors. So you can build all of the other minor with the same process. Pick the note, every note in the musical alphabet, 12 of them, and apply that formula to it is one way that you can look at the minor. And then we have the Locrian, the weird one. It's weird because it has a flat fifth in it. So we'll talk about that later, which makes it a little unstable, I guess it would be the term. So we're going to say this is going to be the B. So if I want the related mode, how do we pull that? We just say that's the 3. So the 3 is going to be the starting point. This is called mode number 7. It's the one with a dot, which I'm having represent the diminished, which we'll talk about later. So I would still like to call it the 7 mode, but they're going to want to renumber it as the 1 if you think about it from a scale position. And so then we start from the 3, and then we apply the formula out from the 7, right? Which means that's the end of the formula. So you have the 1, which takes me back to the C, right? And again, notice that these positions between the numbering system, if you think about them as absolute numbering system, will always be the same. So notice we have I'm on the B, the 3. The 3 is always going to be 1/2 step to go to this to this position, which is going to be the Ionian, right? If I think about it as I'm in the Ionian position, what happens to be a C, Ionian plus 2 is going to get me to the mode number 2, which is the Dorian, which in this case is a D. Mode number 2 Dorian plus 1 is going to get me to mode number 3, which is Phrygian, which in this case is an E, right? And so on and so forth. The same happens up here, right? It's just now I'm on the 6, but if I looked at the 7 here, here's the 7, it's still going to say plus 1, right? 7 plus 1, meaning the Locrian, if you name it always Locrian or always absolute mode number 7, is always going to be 1/2 step to get to the Ionian, right? Whereas if you rename it as a relative position, now you have to memorize the distance between each step. You have to rename the distance. You don't need to do that if you just memorize the absolute distances. Then you can intimately know the distances between each of the nodes. That'll give you way more flexibility. Causes some naming convention problems, but I'll talk more about that later. So then we can copy this all the way to the 12 intervals. So if you look at this could be useful, this table, because of course now you can kind of map this out and you can look at any of the collection of notes and any of the 12 keys, and you can look at any of the collection of notes making any of the 7 notes within that collection the tonic, and you can kind of compare and contrast them. If you see it in Excel, you can actually hide some of the cells to combine them. Remember that practically one of the things you want to be able to compare and contrast are the collection of notes that are relative, as we did in this column. It doesn't work on every column, but we did it on this column, the relative ones, because those are the ones you can easily switch between if you're playing like the guitar. You want to like maneuver around between the Ionian to the Dorian to the Phrygian. All you have to do is shift the tonic. All you have to do is shift the tonic. Or you want to learn the parallel ones, meaning you're going from the C Ionian to C Dorian to C Phrygian to C Lydian to C Mixolydian. That means the tonic stays the same, but you're going to a different mode, which results in a shape that's parallel. It's not diatonically, not the same notes, but it's all the same shape. And that will give you a different feel, like in the blues, typically the 1-4-5 not being same diatonic, but having the same shape, which is going to give you that distinct feel, in that case with the 7, the dominant 7 in it. All right, so that's going to be the general idea. This can be overwhelming, but remember, when it comes down to it, what are you trying to do? You're trying to remember this one shape. I don't care how you do it, right? Whatever cage system, five shapes per fret, whatever you want to do. But as you do so, remember 3 notes per string, whatever you want to do. But as you do so, memorize not just the notes or not even primarily the notes, but the relative position. And don't start to think, well, if I remember the relative positions, that's only going to allow me to play in the key of major. I want to play in minor, I want to play in Dorian, and I can't do it if I remember the relative positions because they change when I go. No, they don't. They don't have to. Keep the number system the same. Make it absolute number system. Those are the name of the modes. Then you can know the relationship between all of them. You can copy them up and back. The shape, the square will be the square no matter what. Ionian's always the top of the square. The back, this is Phrygian, is always going to be back here. You can come up with stories to remember the shape, which we do in some of our presentations and whatnot. They're static. They always are the same. So if you keep the numbering system the same, you will be able to memorize the fretboard way faster. And then all you have to do is bridge the gap for the naming conventions that people are going to want to do when they switch scales, which you can see some people have already kind of dealt with by doing things like the Nashville number system. Let's think that through so that we can understand it exactly what's going on and be able to code switch between the most effective way to visualize the fretboard and the most effective way to communicate that visualization.